everybody. So part 2 of our Heirs of Rome. Another short video that covers a complex and whole class. In fact, I teach a whole class on the history of Islam of University, Simpson University. They still teach the class there, so if this is something that interests you, feel free to email them. If you want more information and books and things, I'd be happy to send your way. But this is looking at another heir of Rome, another sort of part of the Roman Empire that reforms itself into another monotheistic religion. We looked at monotheism in the Byzantine Empire with the form of Christianity. You look at Christianity and what central role it starts to play in Western Christendom. But then also another monotheistic religion emerging out of the Arabian Peninsula is very important and very interesting, and a big concept of world history, because here we're a center of trade for all the traders coming in from the Silk Road, the traders coming in from the Mediterranean, all coming to one important place that has a long history and a major identity of the Bedouin peoples, this nomadic people of that area, and how Muhammad is able to reform them by looking at religion, looking at the importance of their own history. And even today, I was actually in Oxford University a couple weeks ago, and I was on the street looking around, and I had a conversation with a bunch of these Muslim evangelists, I guess you'd say, these Muslims who are trying to show another side of Islam. And, you know, teaching at Simpson University, you have to do declaration of faith. So I could tell you, you know, being a Christian and talking to these Muslims peoples on the street of Oxford was very, very interesting. 90% of the conversation was looking at history, was looking at the way they portray and Christianity portrays Abraham, how Christianity and Islam portrays Jesus, how Christianity and Islam portrays you know, other aspects of history, and looking at the history of Muhammad, looking at the first believers, the first followers of Muhammad, to create this religion of submission, being submissive to God. That's what Islam means. That's what being a Muslim means. It means to submit oneself. You know, big thing that people get, you know, misconceive about this whole thing is that they worship Muhammad. Muhammad is seen as a prophet. They definitely don't. Their first rule is to know God but God. And that's the biggest beef they have, if you will, with Christianity. They see Christianity not as a monotheistic religion, but as a polytheistic religion because of the Trinity. So the whole idea of the Trinity for Islam breaks down the idea of a monotheistic God in their view. Interestingly, if you look at early church doctrine in the 2nd, 3rd century, Christians were having the same debate. The Byzantine Empire, they were having a debate of how to deal with the Trinity, how to deal with Jesus Christ as Son of God and as man. That whole debate was happening in the church. That whole debate was happening at the same time also, 7th, 8th century, when you see Islam coming out. And so Islam went in a direction, they believe in Jesus as a prophet, they don't believe of Jesus as a Son of God. And so there's a huge split between how creating whole different religious views. That's a whole nother class in itself. For us, and the purpose of this class is a very interesting and important phenomenon of looking at the history of Islam, how it comes out of the Arabian Peninsula, what it starts to use with the interactions with world systems of exchange that create the religion. So with the Silk Road, the Mediterranean, the peoples there, the role of the religion from before, looking at Jewish traditions, looking at early Christian traditions, all being the foundation of this religion of Islam. So, and what comes out from there. So there's a lot of interesting things to see. We're going to go through it, just a morsel, just a taste, to see sort of an appetizer, again, of another heir of Rome. But feel free, if you have questions, let me know. An interesting subject. There's some great books on the subject. Here is the second part of our series, Heir of Rome, looking at Islam. So for our last lecture, in fact, our last lecture for the whole class, this is our 6th week, the second part to Heirs of Rome. The last video you saw Byzantine, a little bit of Western Europe, and how sort of the Germanic tribes are starting to form, and Vikings are taking raids are taking place, but it's a lot smaller scale. And in fact, their smaller scale and separation from the rest of the world systems of exchange is evident when the plague of Justinian doesn't hit those regions as hard as it will in the 14th century. When the plague hits again, everything's different in Western Europe. But for Justinian and his empire of the Byzantine Empire, it is in the center of trade networks, of the Silk Road, of what's happening in China and India, even North Africa. And it is hit especially hard with plague. So you can see how that world system of exchange is for better and for worse. Now, we're going to talk about the last heir of Rome. So this other aspect of an empire that emerges from the ashes of the classical Roman Empire is looking at Islam and the Islamic world of its time. So we have to look at the pre-Islamic Arabia and what emerges from this Arabian Peninsula to form a world religion that still is a big part of the world relations today, is it not? And we have a view of the Islamic world, of Islam, of Muslims in Western culture, and as Americans, that, sometimes people don't realize that Americans are Muslims, but the media portrays Islam in a certain way, that portrays it as certain forces. And if I had you in a class, I would ask you to think about all the stereotypes that we in the culture, through movies and news and everything else, has of Islam. And just like everything out of this class, when we looked at cavemen and the stereotypes, when we looked at different things, same with Islam. And we have to understand where it comes from, how it emerges as a major religion, and what are some of the tenets of Islam from its beginnings historically that creates an identity that we still see today. So to begin, this is a picture, this is an image that some of you might be familiar with, those millions of people there in Mecca. And at the center of this, they're all praying. These are all Muslims who are praying specifically at what? This building right here, this cube, is called the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a major point of this, and it's part of the huge legacy of what's happening here of identity of Islam and also the pre-Islamic traditions in this area. And so if you look at this here, this is all part of the Kaaba, and the stone there that you rub, that you walk around the Kaaba 3 times, that you do all these things. It's all part of a legacy. It's all part of identity that comes out of the region. And that's what we're going to talk about and briefly here today. So the study of Arabian Peninsula before Islam, there's 2 huge important factors. One, reasons is historical agency. What factors helped to create this world religion to arise? So despite of your views of what you think of Islam today, it's an important thing for everybody to understand, for historical factors of what creates this world religion to arise. Also, conflict or contribution. Was Christianity always a rival? Today we kind of see it as butting heads with Islam as a state of conflict. Has it always been a state of conflict with Muslim world? Today's events, you might see that in one way or another, but is there any point where it's not the case? Now, again, if you look biblically, if you're a Christian and you look in Genesis, there's reason to believe that from the beginning, with Abraham and having relations with his wife's servant Hagar, and then having a child Ishmael, that is written in the Bible of a Christian perspective as being the foundation of this conflict, and that gives rise to Islam. And you can read that in Genesis. On Islamic side, they do believe in Abraham. And they believe that at that point, and this is the foundation in the Quran, that Abraham left Sarah and left his son Isaac to be with his servant Hagar and to be with his son Ishmael. And I put this picture here because in the Quran, if you're a Christian, you might be familiar with the story of Abraham who brought his son Isaac to the top of the mountain to sacrifice him to the Lord. And at the last minute, the Lord said, no, You do not have to do that. And it was symbolic of what was to come between God and Jesus. So there's also a lot of Christian symbolism happening with that story. In Islam, they have the same story. But Abraham did not take his son Isaac to the top of the mountain, but he took his son Ishmael. So there's important, very at the foundation, there's an important difference of situational stories of individuals. So these are Abraham religions, both Christianity and Islam, but also Judaism, that all play together, but with very fundamental differences in ideas of identity of peoples. It creates a huge shift from the very foundation to today. So again, going back to world systems theory, I talked about last time, but I just really briefly in the last video, but I want to talk about it briefly here, where you have core. Remember I talked about Roman Empire, the core being Rome itself, and then the periphery, the whole lands on the outside. The last heirs of Rome, when you look at Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, the core being what? Constantinople, right? And the rest of the empire being its periphery, but the center of it being there. That is a whole world systems theory by this man Emanuel Wallerstein. So ancient Rome, or the classical Rome here, its core being Rome right there. We talked about Lumberjack Lynch here and his theory of looking at Rome, looking at this idea of the Roman Empire, its system, as this log, and how either decay is the reason for it to fall apart, or outside external threat like this axe here that split this empire of Rome in two. And we talked about the Byzantine Empire. We talked about Western Europe kind of on the fringe of this new empire with post-classical time period. Western Europe doesn't really arise as far as outside. You can see all these dramatic tribes and this different sort of the Visigoths and the Burgundies and the Visigoths, and then we have the Saxons, the Angles, and the Vikings that are going through there. That's all happening and starts to reorganize itself at the year 1000. So that's a future thing. We talked about Byzantium. We talked about Justinian and his plague, and how the millions of people died because of their interaction with the rest of the world eastward. Now, I want to talk about today, on the fringe of all this, another split, if you will, of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, that starts to emerge in this classical period. And between these two empires here, this is the Arabian Peninsula. This is where Islam gets its birth. And it's in this interesting struggle, this sort of juggling of itself as part of the world system of exchange, as part of the Silk Road coming over, and being part of the Byzantine Empire and this Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, both influencing what happens in this area, this very desert area, but with very lush areas in certain places, with oases, major important trade networks to get into North Africa, into the Nile area, and into Egypt. This is a major strategic point, major point for trade, for influence, for both these empires. And this is where Islam comes out of the split, once again, of the Roman Empire, creating the Persian Empire, Byzantine Empire, creating Western Europe, and then what's going to create an Islamic world that's going to take over all this Persian Empire, and it's going to take over all of North Africa, and in fact into Spain by the year 711. And this area here, the Visigoth, which we know today as Spain and Portugal, this will be known as Al-Andalus in the Islamic world, Al-Andalus. And that is part of this Islamic world that's going to emerge with the rise of Islam and Muhammad and what he creates. So you have the Byzantine cores. You have Byzantine on one side. I'll move myself. You have the Byzantine on one side and Hellenistic culture, right? What's Hellenistic mean? That's the Greek culture. You have the Sassanid with the memory of ancient Iran, everything we talked about with Mesopotamia on the other side here. So different identities of the very self, of what self and the other looks like. right? So going back to Herodotus, when Herodotus was talking about Greece and what it meant to be Greek, and opposed to what it meant to be Persian, right, with Zoroastrianism and everything, same thing's happening now, again, with the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. And you read about that, I hope. Byzantine are the champions of Christianity. Persian, again, now they're still continuing on the Zoroastrianism faith. So you have these two big cores, Byzantine, Sassanid, Christianity on one side, Zoroastrianism on the other, both seeing themselves as the official religion, but not really able to contain everything. So despite the strong rivals of these two interactions between the two, what was it like? So you have this empire, you have this trade network that we've talked about with disease coming through and trade, and that at the end of the line it goes through the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire, and also Byzantium. But here's the Arabian Peninsula, and here's, look, there's the Kaaba right there. And one way to think about the Kaaba and what happens in this Arabian Peninsula is that it in itself is a periphery of these two separate core empires. You picking up what I'm throwing down there? So you have the Byzantine Empire one side and its core, this Arabian Peninsula being very much on the periphery of its empire, but also very much on the periphery of this other empire. So it's influenced by both, but it's also able to use its strategic importance as a trade network for both as well. So here you go. You have the homeland of Islam in this Arabian Peninsula being major caravan route for both those empires through Mecca and Medina and all these other places that will take them to the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and to Egypt, to North Africa, but also connecting to the Silk Road. Not all desert. There were settled Arabs in certain regions, but the ones that weren't settling, these were the ones mainly on the caravan routes, are the nomadic tribe members known as the Bedouins. And the Bedouins, they're fiercely independent, they're very pastoral, they're merchants, they're organizers of these caravans, and this is the people of Muhammad. These are the peripheral, powerful home camps and oases of these people. Very nomadic. On one side you have agricultural, on the other side very pastoral. So the very powerful Bedouin culture being very pastoral, being very organized by camps and oases. They're pagan. Before Muhammad organizes them. Whereas on the other side you have cities and monotheism, both in the Sassanid Empire and Byzantium. They're very politically fragmented, these Bedouin. This side here is the Bedouin sort of cultures. This side here is the Sassanid and the Byzantine Empire and how different they are. And then also this being the core sort of ideals and this being the periphery of these two. So they're trying to contain the Arabian Peninsula, but are they able to do that successfully is not going to be happening. They have to create something. Now, before Muhammad and before Islam, the Bedouins were very polytheistic, meaning they had many gods. They culturally borrowed complex gods, different gods. They brought them in. They brought them into the Kaaba. They brought them into that building, the place of religion where you can go and you could pray to whatever God would be most useful to you. They didn't pray to, even though they had a statue in there of Yahweh, of the Jewish God, they didn't pray to him because that wasn't what they needed. They needed some goddess that would protect their camels, bring their camels to water, that would heal their sick. So there was over 600 gods inside the religious house of the Kaaba, where all the people would come together in Mecca and pray and to look at what would be the best for them. And what they took them to was the Kaaba. If you remember the picture I showed you, it's the same thing. All the caravan routes would come here, and they would be known as the harem. Harem is not the word that you think of today, but it's the sanctuary where people were forbidden to fight. That was great for religious purposes, but also trade. And trade was able to flourish here because you wouldn't have tribes fighting over each other. They weren't allowed to. So this early view of Mecca, in fact, this is even a little later of a picture, but in this pre-Islamic time period, this area, this Kaaba, a place of worship for all religions. Even if you're a Buddhist coming across, you can worship the way you want to worship there. If you were from North Africa, you can worship your religious beliefs there. If you were even Jewish, there was, you can go in there and pray. There was poems, and there was all kinds of things to make it attractive to any religion. Now, of course, the people living there, the main Bedouin tribes of this land, were getting extremely rich, not only from the people coming to worship, but remember, this is a place of trade, and this was a major hub where all the people coming in, all the traders were coming in and trading here. If they're coming from the Byzantine Empire, you could worship there as a Christian. If you're from the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire, you can come there and worship your Zoroastrianism religion. All of it had a place in Mecca, and all of it had a place in this Kaaba. And this is important because this is where what arises for today. So you have the children of Abraham, and I mentioned the story of Abraham and his child, but also the story in the Quran is that this Kaaba was first built by Adam under the instruction of Allah. So if you look at Adam and Eve, and it talks about that the very first person in religion, in this religious story of Adam and Eve, was instructed by Allah to build this Kaaba. The story goes on that it was destroyed from the Great Flood. And in the Quran, it talks about that it was rebuilt once again by Noah. So Noah, after the Great Flood, he built the Kaaba. Now, it was lost for hundreds of years. Then it says, as Abraham was out with to find Hagar and Ishmael, remember, the story in the Christian Bible is that he went with Sarah and Isaac. In Islam, it's that he left that family and went with Hagar and Ishmael. And he says, as he was looking for them, he came and refound the Kaaba. And thereon became a spot. In fact, that became the spot where he was going to sacrifice Ishmael for God, but he didn't. And it was the foundation and formation of the Arabs. So even today, the very foundation, this whole story, you can see the slight differences from Christianity if you're a Christian, but this is the foundation, and that place in the Kaaba is the foundation of the Bedouin people, the Arab people, and the foundation of Islam today. So how does this all happen? The messenger and the message. Very first and important thing to understand is that Islam, they do not, if you're Islamic, if you're Muslim, you do not pray to Muhammad. Muhammad is a messenger. His message is to reestablish the faith of a monotheistic faith. That was his role. So in that Kaaba, with what has become corrupted with all those gods and over the centuries, by the time of Muhammad, his role was to clean that out, to clean out that culture in Mecca, to get rid of all the other idols, and to reform the Bedouin people, the Arab people, as a monotheistic people, to be the messenger of God to bring monotheism back. Now, there's a long story. His wife Khadijah, who was, you could kind of say, a cougar. I think he was in his 20s and she was in her 40s. His uncle, who became one of the main supporters of Muhammad and his thing, is Ali. When he's elected as the caliph later on, that is the Shiites, right? So that's where you get the word Shiite. Abu Bakr is his closest friend. What Muhammad does is he has a revelation. He goes onto a mountaintop, and there he is spoken to by an angel. The archangel Gabriel is what it talks about in the Quran. And there he is told that there is no God but God, and that he is the messenger. And that is the first sort of message of Islam. Everyone, and the Azan is what it's called. They say there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger. It's a revelation to submit to God. And that's why Muslim, the word Muslim, means a person who submits. And Islam means submission. It's all about submitting to God. And so what they believe, and the difference between Christianity is seen by Islam as a polytheistic religion because of the Trinity. So in Christianity, you have the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In Islam, they see the Son and Holy Ghost as separate than God. So God is there's no God but God. So in their view, that is the difference between Christianity and Islam. That is where Christianity and Islamic view falls short, is because of worshiping or seeing as one both the Holy Spirit and Jesus. Now, that's important because during this time period, there was actually a lot of rivals in the Christian faith about how to deal with the Trinity. So, everything that's happening in the Byzantium world and the Christian sort of, if you look at different debates that are happening about how to deal with the Trinity, all that is trickling into this area of the Arabian Peninsula. And there's lots of evidence to show that Muhammad was interacting with Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians from Byzantium, and all that influenced this formation of Islam. So what Muhammad started to do, and what his followers started to do, was to clean house, restore, just in the post-classical way of doing things, restore the original way that Abraham, they believe Abraham and the way they believe everything was meant to be with the Kaaba and the religions in Mecca. So they cleaned out the Kaaba. They got rid of all the polytheistic religions. They made sure that only this was the main important part of the area. And this was not popular. One thing is it drove out business, right? So this is a place that was getting incredibly rich by the Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Empire, all the Buddhist travelers, all the North African. And by cleaning out the Kaaba, that cleans out the whole sort of formation of commerce of this area. Now, the only thing that was keeping Muhammad alive was his wife, Khadijah. She was a very powerful merchant in her own right. Her and his uncle, Muhammad's uncle, were part of a very powerful tribe, and that tribe was protecting him. When his wife and his uncle died in 620 CE, he then lost his protection, and Muhammad had to flee. And this is when he leaves Mecca. It's called the Hijra in Islamic culture, and he fled to Medina. And in Islam, there's a different year system, and this marks the year 1 when he flees to Medina. And there is where Islam takes root, because who flees with him and who is attracted to him are this new form of believers. The Ummah is the cult, the community of believers that forms around Muhammad, and from there starts to create a system of ways of life, of praying, of how to submit to God, and this is where it becomes Muslims. Okay, by the time of Muhammad's death, there's war of holy conquest, there's a jihad. They were able to bring most of Western Arabia under Islamic rule, able to go back to Mecca and force authorities to submit and have Muhammad as the leader by 630. So all this starts to take root after 622 when they flee to Medina, and Muhammad and his followers. And then by 630, you get this whole empire of Islamic believers starting to spread and to form a new alliance and new way of this peninsula. From the mid-7th century, so from 630 onward into about 1200, you can say. You can actually say 1492. 1492 is the last sort of drive of Islamic culture out of this peninsula here, which the money used to drive both the Jews and the Muslims out of this region gives the king and queen money to give to Columbus, who then sails the ocean blue and finds America. But that's another story. What we're talking about in 630 in this Arabian Peninsula, fleeing to Medina, coming back to Mecca, and creating an empire. And this purple here is Islamic territory by Muhammad's death. So a huge part of the Arabian Peninsula is under his control. But thereafter, what is known as the caliphates, those who are successors of Muhammad, the caliph, and you hear words with the caliphate today, the Islamic State being a new caliphate. They're going to the memory of what happened after Muhammad and the Islamic expansion after 632. So from 632 to 650, you have an expansion. You have another expansion from 750, and these caliphates create their own Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, this Islamic world in its own right. If you hear words today of IS, Islamic State, what their rhetoric they're talking about is going back to this memory of these early caliphates of interaction and submission to Islam with a one ruler and a one world order. So that's what they're talking about here. That's worth talking about. And it creates, and they take over the Sassanid Empire, and they create a new sort of rivalry between the Byzantine Emperor. Later on, a rivalry with the Western Europe, which then gets arrived to the Crusades. But, you know, that's another story altogether that's coming out of this. Now, the Ummah, this is the important part of the identity. The community of all Muslims around the world are known as the Ummah. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter if you're from India, from Myanmar, from China, from United States. You're part of the Ummah if you're a Muslim. This is a new identity that's able to be formed through the faith. Right? So you're able to rechange your identity. You could be whoever you are or whatever nationality you are, but you could be part of the Ummah. The first work to unite Jewish groups with Muhammad was trying to unite Jewish groups into this Ummah because they were all part of the same foundation, the same sort of sons of Abraham, if you will. Father Abraham had many sons, if you've heard that song. And that's what Muhammad's trying to work with, and saying that Jewish are part, and hoping that Jews would listen to this new prophet of Muhammad. After Mecca, after Muhammad goes back to Mecca, he sees the Jews as disloyal and starts to expel and eliminate them. So you start to see, right with Muhammad, sort of a conflict with looking at Jews and later with Christians, but still able to have them within the empire. They would be able to remain in the Islamic Empire as being called the Dhimmi, or Dhummi, and that's the people that are of the book. So those are the people who are of Abraham, but not followers of Muhammad, not followers of Islam. And so they had to pay a special tax. So you could be protected under the Islamic world rule, but you would pay a special tax as a Jew or a Christian. So that was part of this world that was forming. The core message, and this talks about in the book, but without getting into too much detail of Islam, the 5 main pillars of Islam. First, to profess that there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's the first thing that they proclaim. Also to pray 5 times a day towards Mecca, give generously, to give help to the community and to the needy. That's important to give. To fast during the months of Ramadan. That's the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, which is for self-purification. And then pilgrimage. You should try, if you're able to, once in your life at least, to journey to Mecca. Now, this is an important part for world religion, because anywhere in the world you're able to pick up these core beliefs, and at one point you don't have to live in the Arabian Peninsula, you don't have to live in Mecca, but you have to try to get there. Still to this day, that is why you see those huge pictures of those people around the Kaaba for the Hajj and pilgrimage to the Hajj. So that's all part of the foundation of this religion, and playing an important role in this next stage of world history. Lastly, I want to focus on the successors of Muhammad, and this is the caliphates, right? So this is what IS today is trying to play off of, but they're not successfully. This is something completely different. But this is what's happening. So Muhammad's seen as the direct link to God, his community, the Ummah, acting under the command of God. So the Ummah being Islam, being the followers of Islam, being the Muslims. There's no division between religion and secular affairs. It's all one. And Muhammad is creating that in his rest of his life until his death. His sudden death caused a crisis of who would be the next leader. Some people would argue that it had to be a hereditary line, the people in the life of Muhammad, its actual ancestor of Muhammad. So you have that on one side. You also have those who would elect a leader on the other side, and who would be the closest, who are seen as the closest to Muhammad, but not necessarily a blood relative. And that was seen on the other side. That gives rise to this whole sort of split between Islam that will become known as the Shiites and the Sunni. The Sunni being the ones that would be elect from the very beginning. The Sunni were the ones that elected the leader to be Abu Bakr, whereas the other ones wanted it to be the hereditary bloodline of Ali, and that's the followers of Ali, the party of Ali, the Shiites. So that's the other side. Collectively, so under the first caliphate of Abu Bakr, who was elected as the first caliph, he's the one who collected the words of Muhammad. He's the one that collected and started to write down everything into the Quran. The Quran being the administration base of being the main way to follow the words of the life of Muhammad, to submit yourself to God. You don't worship Muhammad, but you would follow him as an example of how best to be a Muslim, how best to submit yourself. This became a theocracy, isn't it? So this is where the leader of the church becomes the leader of this caliphate and the land around it. And it gives rise to, from 631, the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. This would last from 661 to 750, moving the capital from Mecca to Damascus as a major center of the hub of this whole world, and made the official caliph even more powerful, forcing tribal leaders to accept and to expand all over. And this is the land from up into Spain, North Africa, that whole Sassanid Empire, all the way buttoned up to India and China, creating this massive empire of the Islamic world. Expansion, unanticipated change, with Uthman in 655 ordering the official edition of the Quran. So you get this official writing of this practices of Quran. You get an overthrow moving from Damascus to Baghdad, and a golden age of Islam arising that you read about. And you get, after that, you get the Abbasid dynasty. So you get a dynasty that reigns from 750 to 1258, this massive empire, where you get organized from Sharia law with the Islamic law, the rise of, I think you read about the main things which still today, what people look at to how to be a Muslim, is the hadiths. Now, you can look at the Quran as the book, but you can also look at the people who followed and who heard words of Muhammad, and who had certain ways of doing things, certain ways to dress, certain ways to act, and they look at certain what are called as hadiths. In many ways in Islam, that's what you look at the most, even more so than the Quran, to dictate your actions, is the hadiths. And this starts to really come about with the Umayyad dynasty, but on the Abbasid dynasty. And you get certain hadiths that would support different parts of these dynasties. So that's where you get the shifts and these changes of certain ways of acting with in Islam. And some would follow certain hadiths of the Shiites, some would follow certain hadiths of the Sunni, and it creates some subtle differences that you still see today. So the Abbasid Empire becomes huge, diverse, incorporating different formals of governments, different areas, and really in a lot of ways it starts to change and gradually decline by the 9th century. But within the Abbasid dynasty, and the important thing about this Abbasid dynasty in the times that we have, is what is known as the translation movement. And you talk about this briefly in your textbook, and you could write about this as a term in the exam. Where between the years 750 and 1000, there was a major effort with this whole world and the interaction of goods, but remember, ideas too. So scholars from all over Eurasia and the Mediterranean were coming together to Baghdad to translate books, to translate ancient books from ancient China and India, from from the whole Islamic world of the Middle East now, or the Mesopotamian region, from ancient Greece, from Rome, from all these places coming together and translating books and retaining knowledge of astronomy and medicine and mathematics and geography, and you see technology being built, and this astrolab here, which so people who are far away and don't know which direction to go to pray to, this would allow wherever they are to look towards Mecca. So it's a sort of a compass, an astrolabe, and this was used eventually in navigation in Europe. So and also the different stuff coming from China. So I study medieval paper in Europe, but that paper technology came from China to the Islamic world, and they're translating all this stuff on paper. Eventually, paper making its way to Western Europe, using the compass, which was developed in China, and the compass eventually making its way to Europe. So all these aspects and technology that the world is using is contained in this part of the empire, this Islamic world. And then from there, some would argue that most of Western European philosophy, so of the Greek culture, is retained through this Islamic movement and this translation movement in Baghdad. Now, some of the works that you might see, one of the best medical books is created in this time period, where you see amazing ways to deal with cataracts and how to be able to take a cataract out of an eye, to deal with different diseases. Here's a picture of a rabid dog that's biting this man, and how do you deal with rabies? So this is all medical things that is way beyond its time than Western Europe's going to be able to get for centuries later. And it all happens through this translation movement of knowledge, showing another aspect of a world system of exchange. So we've seen goods, we've seen power of empires, we've seen disease with Justinian plague, but here's also with the translation movement a transfer and an establishment of ideas, a transfer of ideas that become part of this very advanced Islamic world in these centuries. So to finish our whole class, that is the big point of what we see. We see these regions of these river valleys start to have people settle down, create these complex societies. From there, you see early empires and civilizations forming. You start to see transfer of ideas and exchange, and how that changes identity. And we see that, through India and China. And then we finish here with Islam as an example of all these things coming together. Okay. And we see how through these empires and through the heirs of Rome, that there's this empire of the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, that both on their own periphery of the Arabian Peninsula is able to create its own identity using ideas from all over, the interaction, being in the middle of the Silk Road, being interaction of Christianity and Zoroastrianism and Jews being in the middle of this interacting, and their own polytheistic religions, giving rise to a new form of religion, a monotheistic religion of Islam, that's able to use its area and spread its influence and taking over this whole region here, everything dark becomes part of this empire. And even not part of the empire, but the religion itself starts to spread. And you start to see missionaries of Islam going out and making its role in different areas as well. And all these people are coming to Mecca in their Hajj and bringing trade and creating massive networks of exchange just within the empire itself. This is all a major part of world history, where exchange of good people's ideas, disease starts to interact and to change this whole world. And then once again, by 1492, and after Columbus sails the ocean blue, he doesn't discover anything new, but what he does is incorporates a new world system exchange in Western Hemisphere that brings all the complexities of that region to interact with everything we've talked about the last 6 weeks and the interactions of these worlds here. And Islam is a major role, and I hope you get, this shows a different aspect of Islam that you might see on the news, and start to see how this creates an identity and how the important history that Islam has in our own formation of whatever background you have all comes together and plays together in complexities that this whole region of Eurasia and Africa all interact together, and all form a society and identities of who they are, of who others are, that makes world history so dynamic and interesting. And I hope that puts the chapters in a bit more perspective as we finish out this term. Best of luck with the exam, and let me know if any questions arise as you finish out World History 2.